In 1900, a group of lumberjacks took a high-paying job deep in the Appalachian forest, with one simple rule: never cut the weeping oaks. They ignored it, and started disappearing one by one. No bodies. No clues. Just their names mysteriously carved into the trees. What they uncovered beneath those oaks was far worse than death, and by the time they understood the truth, it was already too late. Stay with me, because this story doesn't end the way you think. In the early spring of 1900, when the last traces of winter still clung to the high ridges of the Appalachian Mountains, a group of lumberjacks made their way along a narrow dirt road that twisted through the wilderness. Their boots were worn, their hands calloused, and their faces carried the quiet confidence of men who had spent years wrestling with forests. They had been called from different camps across the region, men who knew the sound of a falling tree better than their own heartbeat. There was Ellis Ward, the foreman, known for his strict discipline and steady judgment. There was Briggs, older than most, with a gray beard and eyes that always seemed to be watching something others could not see. And then there was Thomas Hale, the youngest of them all, barely in his 20s, eager to prove himself. They had all come for the same reason: the pay. Word had spread quickly about a landowner willing to pay nearly double the usual rate for timber work. No one knew much about the man, only his name, Mr. Calder, and the fact that he owned a large, untouched stretch of forest deep in the mountains. Some said he had inherited it. Others whispered he had bought it cheap after something unfortunate had happened there. When the men arrived at the meeting point, a small wooden office near the edge of town, they finally met him. Mr. Calder was not what they expected. He was thin, pale, and unusually quiet. His dark coat looked too heavy for the season, and he kept his gloves on even indoors. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost distant, as if he were thinking about something far away. He didn't waste time with introductions. "The forest must be cleared," he said. "You will be paid upon completion." Then he placed a contract on the table. The paper was thick and slightly yellowed, as though it had been stored for years. The ink was dark, so dark it almost seemed wet, even though it wasn't. Ellis stepped forward and read it carefully. Most of it was standard: boundaries of the land, expected timeline, payment details. But near the bottom, one line stood out: "The weeping oaks must never be cut." Ellis frowned slightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" Mr. Calder didn't hesitate. "There is a grove within the forest. You will recognize it when you see it. Those trees are not to be touched." Thomas chuckled from behind. "Special trees, are they?" No one else laughed. Calder's eyes slowly lifted toward him. "You will not cut them," he repeated. His tone didn't rise, but something about it made the room feel colder. Ellis nodded after a moment. "Fine. We'll work around them." The men signed the contract one by one. As each name was written, Calder watched closely, his expression unreadable. When it was done, he gathered the papers carefully, almost gently, and said, "You should begin at once. The sooner the work is finished, the better." No one asked what he meant. 2 days later, the crew reached the forest. At first glance, it looked like any other stretch of Appalachian woodland: tall trees, thick undergrowth, and the distant sound of birds echoing through the hills. Sunlight filtered through the branches, painting the ground in shifting patches of gold and shadow. The men got to work immediately. Axes swung. Trees creaked and fell. The familiar rhythm of labor settled in, and for a while, everything felt normal. But as they moved deeper into the land, something began to change. The forest grew quieter. It wasn't sudden. It happened slowly, almost unnoticed at first. The birds became fewer. The wind softened. Even the usual rustling of leaves seemed to fade. By the afternoon of the second day, Thomas was the first to mention it. "Feels strange out here," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Too quiet." Briggs, who was sharpening his axe nearby, didn't look up. quiet's not always a good thing. Ellis overheard but said nothing. He had noticed it too. Still, work continued. It wasn't until the third day that they found the grove. They didn't stumble upon it all at once. Instead, the forest seemed to guide them there, the trees growing taller and closer together until the light dimmed and the air turned heavy. And then, suddenly, they were standing at its edge. The weeping oaks. There were perhaps a dozen of them, arranged in a loose circle. Each tree was massive, far older than anything they had seen in the surrounding forest. Their branches drooped low, hanging like long, heavy arms. The leaves were darker, thicker, and they barely moved, even when the wind picked up outside the grove. But what caught everyone's attention was the bark. It was wet. Not with rain, but with a thick, dark sap that slowly trickled down in thin lines, like tears sliding across skin. Thomas stepped closer, curiosity shining in his eyes. "Well, that's something." "Don't," Briggs said sharply. Thomas paused. "Don't what?" "Don't get too close." Ellis walked forward, studying the trees carefully. He circled the edge of the grove, his boots crunching softly against the ground. There were no signs of animals. No nests. No tracks. Nothing lived here. "All right," he finally said. "We leave this area alone. Just like the contract says." Thomas smirked. "You actually believe all that?" Ellis gave him a hard look. "I believe we're getting paid to do a job. And part of that job is not touching these trees." Thomas raised his hands in mock surrender. "All right, boss. Just trees, though." But even he didn't step any closer. As the sun began to set, the crew returned to camp, setting up tents a short distance from the grove. They built a fire, cooked their meals, and tried to settle into the usual routine. But something followed them back. A feeling. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was something quieter. A sense of being watched, even when no one was there. That night, as the fire burned low and the men drifted off to sleep, the forest remained silent. Too silent. And somewhere, deep within the circle of the weeping oaks, something shifted. No one saw it. But by morning, things would already be different. The first night passed without incident, or at least, that's what the men told themselves. The fire had burned low, and one by one the lumberjacks had drifted into uneasy sleep. The forest around them remained unnaturally quiet. No insects hummed. No owls called. Even the wind seemed to avoid their camp, as if it, too, refused to pass through that place. But not everyone slept well. Ellis Ward lay awake longer than the others, staring up at the dark outline of the trees above his tent. He couldn't explain it, but something about the forest felt wrong. It wasn't just the silence, it was the weight of it, pressing down on everything. At some point, he must have dozed off. Because the next thing he remembered was waking to the sound of footsteps. Soft. Slow. Circling the camp. Ellis sat up, listening carefully. The footsteps didn't sound like any of the men. They were too light, too uneven. He reached for his boots but hesitated. "Hello," he called out quietly. No answer. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence again. Then, faintly, he thought he heard something else. A whisper. Not a word he could understand, just a low, distant murmur, like voices carried through thick walls. Ellis stepped out of his tent, scanning the darkness. The fire had nearly died, leaving only a faint glow. The other men were still asleep, their shapes barely visible in the shadows. "Briggs," he whispered. No response. He walked a slow circle around the camp. The ground was undisturbed. No fresh tracks. No movement in the trees. Finally, convincing himself it had been a dream, or perhaps just nerves, he returned to his tent. By morning, he almost believed it. The sun rose pale and weak through the trees. The men gathered around the fire, stretching and preparing for another day of work. It was Thomas who noticed first. "Where's Hale?" At first, no one reacted. It wasn't unusual for someone to wander off early, especially for a bit of privacy. But as the minutes passed, the question began to settle in. Ellis looked around. Thomas. No answer. They checked his tent. His blanket was thrown aside, as if he had gotten up quickly. His boots were gone. Briggs frowned. "He didn't say anything last night." Ellis shook his head. "No." A strange tension began to spread through the group. It wasn't panic yet, just confusion. "Probably went for a walk," one of the men said. Kid couldn't sit still to save his life. Thomas had indeed been restless. The evening before, he had joked again about the WeepingOaks, saying he might take a closer look when no one was watching. Ellis didn't like that thought. "All right," he said firmly. "We split up. Stay within shouting distance. If you find him, call out." The men grabbed their gear and spread out into the forest. At first, the search seemed routine. They called Thomas's name again and again, their voices echoing faintly through the trees. The forest gave no reply. Ellis moved steadily, scanning the ground for tracks. It didn't take long before he found them. Boot prints. Fresh. Leading away from camp. He crouched down, studying them carefully. The soil was soft enough to hold a clear impression. There was no mistaking it, Thomas had walked this way during the night. Ellis followed the trail, his jaw tightening. The footprints led deeper into the forest. Toward the grove. Briggs caught up with him a few minutes later. He didn't need to ask where they were going. "He went there, didn't he?" Briggs muttered. Ellis didn't answer. They walked in silence, the air growing heavier with each step. The trees seemed taller here, their branches stretching overhead like a ceiling. And then they reached the edge of the WeepingOaks. The grove stood exactly as it had before, still, dark, and silent. But now, something felt different. The ground near the entrance was disturbed. Ellis stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the soil. The footprints continued straight into the grove. Briggs grabbed his arm. "Don't." Ellis pulled free. "We're not leaving him here." He stepped inside. The air changed immediately. It was colder, thicker, harder to breathe. The smell of damp earth and something else, something older, filled his nose. The trees loomed above them, their branches hanging low like watching figures. Ellis followed the prints carefully. One step. Then another. The trail moved deeper into the circle. And then it stopped. Just stopped. The last footprint was clear and deep, pressed firmly into the soil. But beyond it, there was nothing. No sign of a struggle. No drag marks. No second set of tracks. Thomas Hale had simply vanished. The others arrived shortly after, their faces tense and pale. "Anything?" one of them asked. Ellis shook his head. Briggs spoke quietly. "That's not possible." But it was. They searched the grove for hours. Every inch of ground, every tree, every shadow. Nothing. No torn clothing. No tools. No blood. Just the silent circle of the WeepingOaks, standing as if nothing had happened. At one point, one of the men swore he heard something above them, a faint creaking sound, like wood shifting in the wind. They all looked up. The branches hung low and still. But for a brief moment, Ellis thought he saw something move. Not an animal. Not a bird. Something, watching. Then it was gone. By the time they returned to camp, the mood had changed completely. No one joked anymore. No one spoke unless necessary. Thomas Hale was gone. And no one could explain how. That evening, Briggs sat by the fire, staring into the flames. "We should leave," he said quietly. Ellis didn't respond. "This place isn't right," Briggs continued. "You saw it. A man doesn't just disappear like that." Ellis finally looked up. "We don't know what happened." Briggs met his gaze. "I do." The fire crackled between them. Ellis shook his head. "We finished the job." Briggs didn't argue further, but the look on his face said everything. That night, no one slept easily. And as darkness settled over the camp once more, the forest remained silent. Too silent. As if it were waiting for the next name. After Thomas Hale vanished, the forest no longer felt like a place of work. It felt like a place that was watching them, waiting for something. The men still swung their axes, still followed Ellis Ward's orders, but the rhythm was broken. Every crack of wood echoed too loudly. Every falling tree sounded like a warning instead of a task completed. And no one went near the weeping oaks. Not alone. The second night was worse than the first. No one admitted it openly, but most of the men stayed awake. Some sat by the fire long after it should have died. Others lay in their tents, eyes open, listening. That silence was no longer just strange. It was unbearable. At some point past midnight, one of the men, Cooper, claimed he heard breathing outside his tent. Not footsteps this time, not whispers. Just slow, steady breathing, like someone standing inches away. He held his breath, listening. The sound continued. In. Out. In. Out. Too close. Too real. Finally, gathering what courage he had, Cooper grabbed his lantern and stepped outside. Nothing. The camp was empty. The fire had burned down to embers. The other tents were still. But the feeling didn't leave. It followed him back inside. Morning came slowly, as if the sun itself was reluctant to rise over that part of the forest. The men gathered again, quieter than before. Eyes were tired. Faces were tense. Ellis tried to keep things steady. "We stay focused," he said. "We work. We keep together." No one argued. But no one looked convinced. It happened just after midday. Another man, Samuel Reed, failed to return from a short walk beyond the camp. This time, they noticed sooner. And this time, the fear came faster. "Not again," someone whispered. Ellis didn't wait. "We search." Same as before. But deep down, they all knew where this would lead. The trail was easier to follow this time. Reed's footprints were clear, pressed heavily into the soil as if he had been walking faster than usual. Maybe he had been afraid. Maybe he had already felt something behind him. The prints led in a familiar direction. Toward the grove. No one spoke as they followed. The forest seemed darker now, even in daylight. The air hung thick and still, pressing against their chests. When they reached the weeping oaks, the men hesitated. Ellis didn't. He stepped inside first. One by one, the others followed. The grove felt colder than before. Not just cool, but cold in a way that didn't belong to the season. The kind of cold that settled into bones. Ellis moved carefully, scanning the ground. "There," he said. "The footprints." Reed's trail led between two of the largest oaks, straight toward the center of the circle. And just like Thomas's, they stopped. Gone. No sign of where he had gone. No struggle. No second set of tracks. Just emptiness. A low murmur spread through the group. "This isn't right. It's not possible." Briggs said nothing. He was staring at one of the trees. "Ellis," he said quietly. Ellis turned. "What?" Briggs pointed. "Look." At first, Ellis didn't understand what he was seeing. Then he stepped closer. Carved into the bark of one of the weeping oaks was a name. Thomas. The letters were uneven, jagged, as if they had been scratched in a hurry. The wood around them looked fresh, pale beneath the dark outer bark. And from the carving, thick sap slowly oozed out. Dark. Almost black. Dripping down like tears. No one spoke for several seconds. Then someone whispered, "That wasn't there before." Ellis knew it was true. He would have seen it. They all would have. Briggs stepped closer, his face pale. "It's marking them," he said. Ellis shook his head quickly. "No. Someone did this." "Who?" Briggs snapped. "We're all here." Ellis had no answer. The men began searching the grove again, but their focus had changed. Now, they weren't just looking for Reed. They were watching the trees. Every movement of a branch made them flinch. Every drop of sap felt like something alive. "Over here," one of them called suddenly. They rushed toward the voice. Another tree. Another carving. Reed. The same jagged letters. The same dark sap slowly running down the bark. Reed's name had appeared. Just like Thomas's. Panic spread instantly. "No, no, this isn't real. We need to leave. Now. They're still here, somewhere, they have to be." Ellis raised his voice. "Enough." The men fell silent, but their fear didn't. Ellis looked at the carvings again. His mind raced for an explanation, any explanation that made sense. But nothing did. Briggs stepped back slowly, shaking his head. "I told you," he said. "This place, it's wrong." Ellis turned to him. "You said something before. About this land." Briggs hesitated. Then he spoke. "I heard about this place years ago," Briggs said quietly. "From a man in a town not far from here. Said there used to be settlers on this land. Families. Farmers." The men listened, drawn in despite themselves. "Something happened," Briggs continued. "No one agrees on what. Some say they turned on each other. Others say outsiders came through. But when it was over, they were all dead." He gestured toward the ground beneath them. "Buried right here." The men shifted uneasily. "And the trees?" Ellis asked. Briggs looked up at the massive oaks. "They planted them after. Or maybe, they grew on their own. But people started noticing things. Strange things. Voices. Disappearances." He paused. "They say the trees remember." A sudden sound cut through the air. A creak. Loud. Above them. Everyone froze. Slowly, they looked up. The branches of the weeping oak swayed gently, though there was no wind. And for a brief moment, Ellis thought he saw shapes between them. Not leaves. Not shadows. Figures. Hanging. Watching. Then the movement stopped. The branches went still again. No one spoke. No one needed to. They left the grove quickly, not running, but close to it. Back at camp, the silence returned. But now, it was filled with something else. Understanding. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't coincidence. One by one, the missing men's names were appearing on the trees. And as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the forest, a single thought settled into every mind. The grove wasn't just watching them. It was choosing. And it hadn't finished yet. By the fourth day, fear had taken hold of the camp completely. It was no longer something the men tried to hide. It showed in their shaking hands, in the way they stayed close together, in the way their eyes constantly drifted toward the direction of the weeping oaks. No one laughed anymore. No one spoke unless they had to. Even the sound of axes had slowed, each swing hesitant, as if the forest itself were listening and might answer back. 3 men were gone. Thomas Hale. Samuel Reed. And now another, Cooper, who had vanished sometime during the night without a sound. His bedroll had been found empty that morning. No tracks. No clues. Just absence. Ellis Ward stood at the center of camp, staring at the ground as the remaining men gathered around him. There were fewer of them now. Too few. "We can't keep going like this," one of the men said, his voice tight with panic. "We're being picked off one by one." "Then we leave," another added quickly. "Forget the money. This place isn't right." A murmur of agreement spread through the group. But Ellis didn't respond right away. He looked up slowly, his face hard, though his eyes betrayed something deeper, uncertainty. "If we leave now," he said, "we walk out with nothing." "Better nothing than dead," someone snapped. Silence followed. Ellis clenched his jaw. He understood their fear. He felt it too. But something else held him in place. The contract. The strange warning. And those names carved into the trees. "We don't even know what we're dealing with," he said finally. Briggs stepped forward. "We do," he said quietly. "You just don't want to admit it." Ellis turned to him. "And what would you call it?" Briggs didn't hesitate. "A trap." The word hung in the air. That afternoon, they returned to the grove. Not to search. Not this time. But to confront it. The men moved together, closer than before, their tools gripped tightly, not like workers, but like men preparing for something they didn't understand. When they reached the weeping oaks, the forest seemed to react. The air grew colder. The silence deepened. Even the light dimmed, as if something above them was blocking the sun. Ellis stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the trees. The carvings were still there. Thomas. Reed. Cooper. 3 names. 3 missing men. The sap continued to drip slowly from each carving, thick and dark, trailing down the bark like fresh wounds. Ellis stared at them, his thoughts racing. Then he spoke. "We cut them down." The words shocked the group. Briggs turned sharply. "No." Ellis didn't look at him. "Whatever this is, it's tied to these trees. We remove them, we stop it." "You don't know that," Briggs said, his voice rising. "You could make it worse. And doing nothing is working." Ellis shot back. No one answered. The truth was clear. They were running out of time. After a long silence, one of the men stepped forward. "I'll do it," he said quietly. His name was Carter. He had said little since the disappearances began, but now there was a strange determination in his eyes, fear mixed with something else. Desperation. Ellis nodded once. "Do it fast." Carter approached the nearest oak slowly. Each step seemed heavier than the last, as if the ground itself resisted him. The others watched from a distance, tense and silent. Briggs shook his head, whispering under his breath, "This is a mistake." Carter raised his axe. For a moment, everything was still. Then, crack. The blade struck the bark. The sound that followed was not what anyone expected. It wasn't the dull thud of metal hitting wood. It was something deeper. Hollow. Echoing. Like a distant cry rising from beneath the earth. Carter froze. The forest responded instantly. A low rumble rolled through the ground, subtle at first, then stronger. The men stumbled slightly, struggling to keep their footing. "What is that?" someone shouted. The sky above the grove darkened unnaturally fast, clouds forming where there had been none. The air turned sharp and cold, biting against their skin. "Stop!" Briggs yelled. "Stop now!" But it was too late. The ground split open. Not wide, but enough. Thin cracks spread outward from the base of the oak, like veins beneath the soil. And from those cracks, roots began to move. Not grow. Move. They twisted upward, breaking through the dirt with unnatural speed. Thick, gnarled roots coiled and stretched like living things, writhing across the ground. "Run!" Ellis shouted. The men turned, but the forest seemed to shift around them. Paths that had been clear moments ago were gone. Trees loomed closer. The grove felt tighter, smaller, like it was closing in. Carter tried to pull his axe free, but the bark seemed to hold it. A root shot upward, wrapping around his leg. He screamed. Another root followed, coiling around his waist, dragging him down. The others watched in horror as the ground beneath him opened just enough to swallow him whole. His screams cut off instantly. Gone. Panic exploded. Men ran in every direction, crashing through branches, tripping over roots that seemed to rise beneath their feet. One of them was thrown violently against a tree, the impact snapping his body with a sickening crack. He collapsed, unmoving. Another disappeared between the shifting trunks, his voice fading into the distance. Ellis pushed forward, forcing his way through the chaos. "Stay together," he shouted. But no one could hear him. Or maybe they just couldn't obey. The grove was alive. Branches creaked and bent, reaching lower than before. The trunks groaned, as if straining under some unseen force. And above it all, that sound returned. The whispering. Louder now. Layered. Dozens of voices, overlapping, rising and falling in a language no one could understand. Ellis covered his ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just outside. It was inside his head. Somehow, he broke free. He stumbled out of the grove, gasping, his chest burning as if he had been holding his breath for too long. A few others emerged behind him. Fewer than before. Much fewer. They didn't stop running until they reached the camp. Night fell quickly. No one spoke. No one moved more than necessary. The forest had gone silent again. As if nothing had happened. Ellis sat alone in his tent, his hands trembling. His mind replayed the moment again and again, the strike of the axe, the sound, the ground opening. He had made the decision. And now more men were gone. A soft sound broke his thoughts. Paper shifting. Ellis looked down. On the small table beside him lay something that hadn't been there before. A single sheet of paper. He reached for it slowly. It was thick. Yellowed. And written in that same dark, heavy ink. Ellis felt his stomach drop as he read the words. "You were warned." Below it, in fresh ink. Names. New names. Ones he recognized. Ones that had not yet been carved into the trees. Ellis stared at the list, his breath shallow. The grove hadn't been destroyed. It had answered. And it was still choosing. By morning, the camp no longer felt like a place where men lived. It felt abandoned. Cold ashes sat where the fire once burned. Tools lay scattered, some half buried in dirt as if dropped in panic. Tents flapped weakly in a wind that had returned only after the night's chaos ended. And of all the men who had arrived days before, only 3 remained. Ellis Ward, Briggs, and Jonah. No one spoke at first. They didn't need to. The truth hung heavy in the air, pressing down on them harder than the silence ever had. Ellis stood near the edge of camp, staring toward the direction of the weeping oaks. His face looked older now, as if the past few days had carved years into it. Briggs sat on a log, hands clasped tightly, his knuckles pale. He had stopped shaking, but not because he was calm. It was the stillness of someone who had already accepted something terrible. Jonah stood apart from both of them. He had always been quiet, keeping to himself even before the disappearances. But now there was something different about him. Not fear. Recognition. "We can't stay," Ellis said finally. His voice sounded rough, like he hadn't used it in hours. Briggs didn't look up. "You still think leaving will save us?" Ellis hesitated. He didn't answer. Because he wasn't sure anymore. Jonah spoke then, his voice low but steady. "It doesn't matter where we go." Ellis turned to him. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jonah met his gaze. "Once it starts, it doesn't stop." A silence followed. Briggs looked up slowly. "You know something." Jonah didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the trees in the distance. Then he said, "We need to go back." Ellis frowned. "Back where?" "The grove." Briggs shook his head instantly. "No. We barely made it out alive." Jonah stepped closer. "You want to understand what's happening?" "That's where it began." Ellis studied him carefully. "Why do you sound so sure?" Jonah's expression didn't change. "Because I've heard about this place before." An hour later, the three men stood once again at the edge of the weeping oaks. The grove looked calm. Peaceful, even. No movement. No sound. No sign of the violence from the day before. But that only made it worse. They stepped inside together. The carvings were still there. More of them now. Names lined the bark of several trees, each one fresh, each one slowly bleeding dark sap. Ellis forced himself not to look too closely. "We dig," Jonah said. Briggs stared at him. "You think that's a good idea?" Jonah didn't hesitate. "It's the only idea we have." They chose the largest oak in the center of the grove. It towered above the others, its trunk thick and twisted, its branches hanging lower than the rest, like arms reaching down. The ground beneath it was softer. As if it had been disturbed before. Ellis drove the shovel into the soil. The earth gave way easily. Too easily. They worked in silence. Each scoop of dirt revealed darker soil beneath, damp and heavy. Then, clang. Ellis stopped. He knelt down, brushing the dirt aside with his hands. Bone. A human skull, partially buried, its empty eye sockets staring upward. Briggs stepped back. "Dear God." Jonah didn't react. "Keep digging," he said. They uncovered more. Bones tangled together, arms, ribs, fragments of clothing barely held together by time. Not one body. Dozens. Men. Women. Even smaller remains that could only belong to children. All buried together beneath the tree. Ellis felt his stomach turn. "This isn't just a grave." Jonah nodded. "It's a pit." As they cleared more soil, something else appeared. Metal. Old. Rust-covered. Ellis pulled it free. An axe head. Not modern, older than anything they had brought with them. Briggs stared at it. "That's logging equipment." Ellis looked around the pit. More tools began to emerge. Broken handles. Bent blades. Proof. This had happened before. Briggs let out a slow breath. "Other crews." Ellis nodded grimly. Jonah finally spoke again. "It's a cycle." They stopped digging. The truth had already been uncovered. Ellis wiped his hands, though the dirt didn't seem to come off. They knew, he said quietly. Calder knew. Briggs looked at him. Of course he did. Ellis clenched his fists. Then why send us here? Jonah answered before Briggs could. Because it needs to continue. Ellis turned sharply. What are you talking about? Jonah's eyes moved slowly across the trees. The forest doesn't just take people, he said. It keeps them. Feeds on them. And when it's done, it waits. For what? Briggs asked. Jonah looked at him. For more. A chill ran through Ellis. The contract, he whispered. Jonah nodded. It's not just a warning. It's an invitation. The realization settled in, heavy and unavoidable. Every few years, a new crew. The same job. The same rule. The same outcome. Briggs backed away from the pit. We need to leave. Now. Before it. He stopped. Ellis turned. What is it? Briggs didn't answer. He was staring at the tree behind Ellis. Slowly, Ellis turned to look. Carved into the bark were 3 new names. Fresh. Deep. Still dripping with dark sap. Briggs. Jonah. Ellis. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Then Briggs whispered, It's already decided. He turned and ran. Straight out of the grove. Ellis shouted after him, but Briggs didn't stop. The trees remained still. Silent. Watching. Jonah didn't move. Ellis looked at him. We have to go. Jonah shook his head. It doesn't matter. Ellis grabbed his arm. We can still get out of here. Jonah pulled free. You don't understand, he said quietly. I do, Ellis snapped. I've seen enough. Jonah interrupted him. My grandfather worked here. Ellis froze. Jonah's voice stayed calm. He was part of a crew. Just like us. He told me what this place does. Ellis stared at him. Then why come here? Jonah's expression didn't change. I didn't come here by accident. The words hit harder than anything else. You knew? Ellis asked. Jonah nodded slightly. I wanted to see if it was true. Ellis took a step back. You brought us here. No, Jonah said. But I didn't try to stop it either. A long silence followed. Then Jonah looked toward the trees. They don't just take bodies, he said. They take names. Once your name is carved, you belong to them. Ellis turned and ran. He didn't look back. Not at Jonah. Not at the grove. Not at the names carved into the trees. Weeks later, a search party entered the forest. They found the camp first. Empty. Then they found Ellis. Sitting at the edge of the grove. Alive. But changed. He didn't speak. Didn't react. Just stared ahead, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Behind him, carved into the bark of the largest oak, were the final names. Briggs. Jonah. Ellis. The land was abandoned soon after. No one claimed it. No one worked it. And no one dared enter the grove again. But sometimes, deep in the Appalachian wilderness, there are still stories. Of a silent forest. Of trees that weep. And of names slowly appearing.